Thank you, David, Dr. Trim, for that very generous introduction. And I want to say that it's an honor, and I'm very glad to be back here at Richards Hall. And thanks to each of you for coming out on this fantastic Sabbath afternoon. So it's an honor just that you have chosen to spend your time here. So let's go ahead and begin the everlasting gospel of the kingdom at hand, Joshua B. Himes, and the resilience. I changed the title, one word, resilience of Second Advent hope. I'm going to start very briefly with a glance at Joshua B. Himes in his 70s. Now, by this time, it would be difficult to blame him if he had decided that he was through with Adventism altogether. In the 1840s, he had then William Miller's closest associate, the principal promoter, manager, and financier of the Second Advent movement. But after at least 3 disappointments over the time of Christ's return, ridicule and slander in the public press, 30 years of infighting between Adventist factions, at least 2 scandals, largely manufactured by fellow Adventists, Himes had abundant reasons for saying, I'm done, I'm out of here. And in fact, by that time, 1876, he was through, not entirely his own choosing, but he was through with denominational Adventism, and would proceed not long afterwards to be ordained as an Episcopalian minister, rector. But nevertheless, at the same time, he said, I am an Adventist, and I have ever been true and faithful to the cause. Now, that was 1876. And in fact, right up until the time of his death, 1895, a little over half a century after 1844, he insisted that I believe that Christ's return is near, and I still preach it, even though he's an Episcopalian. So what kept Joshua B. Himes still an Adventist after all those years? Now, that's a question that Seventh-day Adventists have not, to my knowledge, asked very much, because after all, our Seventh-day branch of the broader Second Advent movement grew, prospered, thrived, whereas the Advent Christian branch that Himes was connected with, that really has not grown, has not flourished in the same way. So it would seem that surely the Seventh-day Adventists would have more to teach Himes and his branch than the other way around. And perhaps, in fact, that's surely true in some respects. Yet today, exactly 178 years after that day of shattering disappointment in 1844, my proposal is that as Seventh-day Adventists, we also might have some insights to gain from considering what made Joshua B. Himes' conviction about the imminence of the Second Advent resilient for more than half a century. Now, in this presentation, I will be drawing on an article that has been published, the Encyclopedia Seventh-day Adventists Online, and it's with a view toward ultimately writing a biography on Himes for the Adventist Pioneer Biography Series. That research is still at a very early stage, but nonetheless, I want to suggest that Himes' legacy demands our attention, if for no other reason than that he was one of 5 founders of Seventh-day Adventism. That's my suggestion, at least. We usually think of James White, Ellen White, and Joseph Bates as our 3 co-founders. But if we take a little bit broader scope include the broader Second Advent movement, then I would contend that William Miller and Joshua B. Himes make up a class of 5 that no others qualified for. 5 co-founders, and he is one of them. It was Himes' skill and resourcefulness as a promoter, communicator, and organizer, along with just an unflagging fervor for the message that would transform William Miller's preaching from a regional curiosity to a national movement. Now, let me just say, if the presentation this afternoon seems a bit meandering, that is probably because it is, hopefully with purpose, but we're going to move through Himes' life chronologically. But then there are going to be some side trips to reflect on some themes that may go on for a while, but rest assured we will get back to the narrative of his life and at least have a loose structure that way. Well, backing up now to the beginning of his life, Joshua von Himes was born in 1805 in the village of Wickford, Rhode Island, to Stukely and Elizabeth Himes. Now, the collapse of his father's prosperous West Indies trade put an end to plans of the young Joshua. They had him on track to attend Brown University and train for the Episcopalian clergy, and that would be a prestigious career. But with the financial ruin of the family, young Joshua at age 13 was apprenticed to a cabinet maker in New Bedford, Massachusetts. But his calling to ministry must have come from a higher source than his parents, because after fulfilling his apprenticeship and marrying Mary Thompson Hardy, he was ordained to ministry in the Christian Connection, which was a kind of a loose network. They just called themselves the Christian Church, but they were one of several restorationist movements in the 19th century dedicated to restoring the New Testament church, sweeping away all claims to authority other than the Bible. And Himes said here, that is in the Christian Connection, I found an open Bible and liberty of thought, and I made good use of it. Himes' early success as an evangelist and a church planter in small town Massachusetts led to a call in 1830 to First Christian Church in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, this church was dwindling and badly in need of a revival. So, but it was an opportunity for Himes. I mean, he had been denied the Ivy League, but now he is in Boston, the nation's leading urban center of cultural influence, and he would make the most of that opportunity. Boston was the hub center for the manifold social reforms that were going on in antebellum America, and Himes was involved in a wide range of them: temperance, women's rights, the peace movement, and the largest cause of all, abolition of slavery. And he was called a radical and an enthusiast by temperament, and among the most radical of radicals. He became an early supporter of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous advocate of immediate abolition of slavery, and also for full equality for people of African descent in American society. And both of those positions were very radical for that point in American society. And the abolitionists were subjected to a great deal of ridicule, denunciation, persecution. Garrison was dragged through the streets of Boston and almost killed in the process by a mob in 1833, for example. So it's quite a significant, and probably you can't read the words. I'm here and there, that quite a bit. I'm using some just reproductions of the actual papers, and we'll see how well they show up. Hopefully most of them will be a little better than this one. But here, Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, is saying of Himes, at a very early period, he avowed himself as an abolitionist. and has been a faithful supporter of the anti-slavery movement, never ashamed to show his colors, never faltering in the darkest hour of its history. It was the relationship between the clergy and Garrison was a very tense one in many ways, and it kind of got worse as time went on. But it was unusual for a clergyman, especially a more conservatively oriented theologically minister, to be supportive and loyally supportive of Garrison at an early time and to stay with him. Many of Himes' church members, as a matter of fact, objected to his extensive involvement in reform movements. They said he'd been neglecting his traditional pastoral duties. Even the quality of his preaching had suffered. He was dismissed as pastor of the First Christian Church in 1836, but many of the younger and more progressive members joined him in forming the Second Christian Church, but is better known for the building that they soon constructed called the Chardon Street Chapel. 500-seat capacity was soon filled, and this then became a meeting place, kind of a conference site, if you will, for the many reform organizations. All kinds of meetings, some quite prominent in American history, took place at this site. Now, in 1840, Joshua B. Himes, as a member of the New England Non-Resistance Society's executive committee, was signatory to an open letter defending Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society for linking its cause to an even more controversial cause, namely women's rights. Now, I don't put this up actually with the intention of you reading it, and in fact, my own purpose for it is not coming through too well, but the main point is just simply to see, I don't know if you can see his name toward the middle of the list of signatories, and then the real purpose, if you will, is that just 2 columns over. You see, anybody see what it says? Signs of the Times. All right. We read there that a new paper is coming out titled Signs of the Times. It would expound the writings of the prophets and apostles relating to the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, the first resurrection, and the end of the world. The publication stated would be conducted by Joshua B. Himes, assisted by William Miller and Josiah Litch, writers on the prophecies. Himes' new cause, the Second Advent movement, was the most sweeping of all. David Arthur, no longer living, but he probably is the foremost scholar on Joshua B. Himes, wrote a dissertation about it. Unfortunately, it was never published, but he said that Himes' cause now was not merely a better world, but a world made new. And it promised soon success, right? Christ would return to earth about the year 1843, according to the movement's evangelist, William Miller. After Miller delivered a series of lectures at Chardon Street Chapel in December 1839, Himes famously confronted the preacher with the question, "Do you really believe this doctrine?" And assured by Miller's response not only of his sincerity, but his readiness for a dramatic expansion of the work, Himes told him, "Prepare for the campaign, where doors should be open in every city in the Union, and the warning should go to the ends of the earth." So Himes became Miller's publicist, booking agent, arranged for him to lecture in the large cities of the East. Before this, Miller had been, kind of in the small towns and villages of New England and way up the state of New York. But now he reaches the large cities. As the movement's chief promoter, Himes utilized the latest developments in communications technology and marketing to orchestrate what a leading scholar of American religious history, Nathan O. Hatch, in his book, The Democratization of American Christianity, says that Himes unleashed an unprecedented media blitz. Now, print technology on a mass scale, that was the new thing. Not that printing was new, but because of the printing press and the steam power applied to it, that's the new thing. And just the whole market economy that had developed in the United States using those print publications to the hilt. It seems like, I don't know how many ages of old fashioned today, but believe me, Himes would have been on every social media platform and he would have known exactly how to integrate everything. He really seemed to have a genius for that. In addition to publishing papers, tracts, and books, he organized conferences that gave the movement coherence and momentum, and camp meetings that galvanized mass audiences, with Father Miller as the spiritual and theological head of the Second Advent movement. Himes became its organizational leader, not in a formal way. There was no formal structure, but practically, effectively, Himes really did rise to leadership. Now, it's not surprising, I suppose, and is perhaps inevitable, that from that time until this, attention has focused on the fevered yet fluid prognostications about times and dates of the lurid tales of behavioral extremes, the sensation and scandal of it all. That's the sort of thing that, that attracts people's attention. And that is what has given most attention with regard to this Millerite movement. But we need to take a little bit of a closer look at the content of the message to understand why it had such staying power for Himes. And I want to say that although I have really only begun to make a start at digging into the primary sources of Millerism, I've been struck by how, actually kind of unclear I've been about the content of the message and how our Seventh-day Adventist historical surveys and books, very, very good, but have not perhaps been particularly effective in making it clear. Now, maybe it's just me. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention before. But take, for instance, the call to the first general conference held October 14, 1840 at Chardon Street Chapel. It begins, the undersigned, believers in the second coming and kingdom of the Messiah at hand, cordially unite in a call of a general conference. You see, Miller is the first signatory listed there in this call. But I want to point out that commitment to his timetable, which even that was approximate and tentative, was not expected or required for those participating in this conference and indeed the move, because the next two names, Henry Dana Ward and Henry Jones, neither of them were ever convinced about a particular date. Himes at this point was convinced about the nearness and the character. We'll get to some of that in a moment of the Second Advent. But he himself was not committed to Miller's specific chronology. Himes later, a couple of years later, 1842, he pointed out that yes, the biblical time prophecies, especially the 1260 and 1290 days and 1335 and then the 2300 days, that unquestionably sparked the conviction that Christ's second coming was near at hand in a way that it was not always near at hand. But yet at the same time, the message of the Advent year in the 1840s was about renewal of the faith that animated the apostolic church and had been perpetuated by witnesses for 18 centuries of Christian history. And many of these are historic figures like the fathers of the church were listed, or not, yeah, listed on the cover of the report for the first General Conference. But anyway, my first point here about the nature, the features of the Second Advent belief is that it was a revival of historic Christian teaching. It was not dependent at its core on specific dates. So this is very fuzzy, but the hope here was that you could see that they have these witnesses from the Protestant Reformation, the early church fathers, down through history as part of the case for their movement. Secondly, note then the predominance of the language of Messiah, King, and Kingdom is striking. The call evoked Jesus' own original, that is the call to the conference in 1840, evoked Jesus' own original gospel announcement: the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent ye and believe the gospel, Mark 1:15. The conveners of the conference were further described as those who believed that the kingdom, which was foretold by the ancient prophets, the kingdom of which Jesus in this world is the prophet, Jesus in heaven is the high priest and mediator, and Jesus in the world to come will be the everlasting king, is near, answering to the prayer that he taught us to say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done as in heaven, so in earth. And so the second coming, the second Advent message was grounded in the full story of the saving career of Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the King, past, present, future. It was not simply a prediction. So I'm calling that a robust biblical theology of the kingdom. And some of these points are interrelated. And I think you'll see that on the third one. And this third, well, they're all important in my mind, but I think, again, back to this tendency to focus on the sensational. Yes, the second Advent message was about the end of the world. That phrase was commonly used. But it most definitely was not about destruction of the planet and evacuation of believers to someplace in the outer realms called heaven. That was not what it was about. The issuers of the call to the Second General Conference in Lowell, Massachusetts, June 1841, identified themselves as looking for the everlasting reign of righteousness in the new creation, which that is Christ will make. And the 5 fundamental principles on which the Second Advent cause is based. They started to publish this in Himes' Advent Herald in 1843. The first one states that the end of the world, the Word of God teaches that this earth is to be regenerated in the restitution of all things, restored to its Eden state as it came from the hand of its maker before the fall, and is to be the eternal abode of the righteous in their resurrection state. So again, the end of the world, yes, in the sense, even destruction. This was a sharp message of judgment. There's no mistaking that. But it was a judgment against the powers of the present world order that is arrayed against the reign of Christ and resistant to it. That is what will be destroyed prior to the recreation, regeneration of a new earth when Jesus is here personally to reign. Now, I don't know how this strikes you, and maybe it will come up in a discussion. It's familiar, certainly, in a way, generally compatible with SDA teaching, but there's some significant contrast, at least shades of emphasis. I mean, I grew up in Sabbath school being taught to sing Más allá del sol, up there is my home, far beyond the sun. And I would hear at camporees and camp meetings, at least what stands out in my mind is where we're going to take this 7-day trip through space. up to heaven. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose, but in and of itself, it may be a problem, or at least something to think about, because I think our prayers, our songs, our discourse about the blessed hope still tend to center more on what we understand will happen at the beginning of and during the millennium, rather than the world made new, which is unquestionably the climax of the biblical story of redemption. Now, I want to add to that yes, the SDA understanding of the millennium provides invaluable insights. It enriches our understanding of the whole great controversy story. But again, perhaps through misplaced emphases, priorities, something has been lost that a fresh look at Miller and Himes and the origin of the Second Advent awakening might help us recover, again, a more robust kingdom theology, but one that is not about evacuation, but new creation. A fourth point about the content of the message. This is one of those long side trips where we get back to Himes' career. Fourth point about the content of the message before doing that, getting back to the narrative. The Second Advent movement that Himes did more than anyone really to make known, to champion, it had a cutting edge appeal in the 1840s. It spoke to issues of the day because it challenged the prevailing post-millennial eschatology that was dominant in American Christendom, according to which a temporal or earthly millennium would precede the return of Christ, before, 1,000 years before the return of Christ and the resurrection of the dead. Now, in part, we could say, well, they weren't lining up the biblical information correctly. They got the sequence wrong, okay? But why is that problematic? The problem was that this incorrect sequencing of the last names opened the way to a fusion of biblical eschatology with chauvinistic nationalism, in which the United States of America became God's chosen nation, the vehicle to the millennium. Lyman Beecher, other than possibly Charles G. Finney, the most influential clergyman in the antebellum era of the 19th century, expressed this nationalistic millennialism in his Plea for the West, 1837. His famous forebear, Jonathan Edwards, said that the millennium would begin in America. America wasn't even a nation yet, I think, still a colony, but Edwards, the great theologian, said the millennium would commence in America. And so Beecher builds on that and says that this nation was in the providence of God, destined to lead the way to the moral and political emancipation of the world. Now, these kinds of sentiments did generate a lot of benevolent social activism. And I think we need to recognize that, not begrudge it. But for Second Advent advocates, the belief that the millennium would come about on Earth through the reform of the American nation state involved too many compromises. It left on the throne a political and economic system that, for all of its enlightened achievements, was based on human pride and glory, and all too often used the notion of millennial destiny to legitimate exploitation, slavery, and violent aggression. So, rather than the triumph of an American empire of liberty, Second Advent message offered a critique of nationalistic millennialism, and it affirmed the ancient and glorious doctrine of the personal reign and immortal triumph of Christ in his glorified kingdom of the earth, and that kingdom is at hand. All right, now back to Himes' career when he fully dedicated himself to the Second Advent cause in January 1840. Himes remained non-committal, as we said, about the specific time designation. But in 1842, there was a general conference. They had a series of these general conferences. And at that one of the resolutions that was agreed upon was that the time had come. See, now we're getting close to Miller's anticipated time, and the resolution says time has come to distinctly avow that God has revealed the time of Christ's second advent. And so Himes joined in that avowal almost entirely. But he always left room for human fallibility. He could still contemplate the possibility of an error in the timetable. But for him, the practical impact of the second Advent teaching kind of took the sting out of that consideration. In this article in Signs of the Times, August 3, 1842, he responds to the question, but what, after all, you should be mistaken. Now, this is after he's come out and said, yes, I'm all for the time. Yes. But, okay, so what if you are mistaken? Well, he says, look at the impact. I mean, the revivals, the transformed lives, and that people are prepared to meet the Lord. The last sentence of this paragraph reads, if then we are mistaken about the time, what harm can result to the church or the world thereby? Because of the practical impact. That is a theme that we'll run through. The fruit, but he was more interested. Now, I think he may well have underestimated the harm that could result, especially when he finally endorsed the seventh month message promoted by Samuel S. Snow that fixed expectation on the specific day, October 22, 1844. Yet, here again, practical results, rather than scripture-based certitude, was the decisive factor. Both he and Miller and other leaders of the movement were very hesitant, very resistant about this seventh month message, saying, okay, the Day of Atonement is the Jewish calendar we're using, points to October 22, and that is when Christ will return at the end of the 2300-day year prophecy. Well, Himes writes to Miller, September 30, okay, 22 days before. This thing, the seventh month message, has gone over the country like lightning. Nearly every lecturer has come into it and are preaching it with zeal and with great success. See, it's the results that matter to him. And so he says, I don't really get the light as to the month and the day, but that's not going to be determinative for Himes. Rather, and I'm quoting again now here, the worldly minded have been quickened and made alive, and all classes have been blessed beyond anything we have seen in time past. He said, this is an influence that I dare not oppose. Well, the failed prediction created a gamut of serious problems for Himes. I'm not sure how much opportunity he had to really personally be disappointed, but he had been subjected to all kinds of ridicule and accusations. You see, with all of these publications and all the money, I mean, he was really transacting a large amount of money, and he was subject to accusations. And then, after Christ did not return on the day to which the greatest expectations were attached, the accusations resumed of venality and corruption and all this. This famous cartoon was actually before 1844, but it shows the grand ascension of the Miller Tabernacle. But here's Himes. And then the devil has him by the coattail. Joshua B., you must stay with me. Because of these charges that he wasn't honest. Well, then, after October 22, these charges reemerged with a vengeance. Wild rumors about the enormous fortune he had raked in and where he had fled with his stash. Texas, Canada, or was it England? Others said he was already in jail facing criminal charges. But Himes and Sylvester Bliss, his co-editor, did a good job. They were thorough, they were transparent, and because of his involvement in the reform movements, Himes had a good reputation with a lot of people in Boston. That helped as well. And they were really able to swing around mainstream opinion fairly quickly, although it took some work doing so. But the greater challenge, of course, was ministering to the needs, both temporal and spiritual, of the Advent people, making sense of what had happened, and determining where the movement should go from here. Now, this is where Himes and the Seventh-day Adventists, future Seventh-day Adventists, would part company. Here is what Himes, by early November, he concluded, the margin of error is past. This date was simply wrong. And he says, we're disappointed, but the authorities on which we based our calculation, in other words, the historians, the calendar experts, what have you, well, they're human, they're fallible, and so we can't really trust them for certitude. We now take the ground that we are near the end and still hold to our published views relating to the personal reign and kingdom of Christ, that the next event in historical prophecy will be the coming of Christ in the elements of heaven. With our present light, we have no knowledge of a fixed day or definite time, but do most fully believe that we should watch and wait for the coming of Christ as an event that may take place at any time. Now, I think most 21st century Seventh-day Adventists could say amen to that statement, but in reality, most of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism did not. And the idea that really emerged earliest in the many newspapers, periodicals published by Adventists, Second Adventists, Millerite people, is centered on the idea that that the midnight cry, that was the message of the seventh month movement, that Christ would come on October 22, 1844. It was fulfilled according to prophecy. But the event was not on earth. But the original thing is probably not the first thing that comes to your mind, unless you studied some more. Then you can't take the test. No. Or you don't get a prize if you knew the answer. But it was to a heavenly marriage ceremony to receive his bride, the true church, those appropriately prepared to meet him, accompany the bridegroom spiritually into the marriage while the door was shut, excluding those who were unprepared. And James and Ellen White, Ellen Harmon, until 1846, August 1846, they were firmly in this shut door or bridegroom camp of post-1844 Adventists initially. Now, the specifics are complex and fluid, but the determinative convictions were that the seventh month message was a movement of God, that the 2300-day prophecy had been fulfilled on that day, October 22, 1844. And then after really about a decade of study and exchange of ideas, the most prominent association with it for the Seventh-day Adventists was a final phase of Christ's ministry as high priest in heaven, beginning on that date. But Himes aggressively opposed all of this because the idea that the door was shut and that the people who had rejected, which was most of America, I suppose, they rejected the Advent message. There was no longer any hope for them. He didn't want to have any of that. He wanted to get on with a renewed heralding of the second Advent message. Then there was also the fact that these shut door or bridegroom Adventists, there was a lot of suspicious stuff going on, ecstatic worship, visions, promiscuous foot washing, both genders together, and the holy kiss. You see, greet one another, the holy kiss. That is a clearly scriptural there. Yet, I think it is significant that Hines actually did not deny that there was a spiritual power of God in the seventh month movement. He was able to say the date was incorrect, but it reached hearts. I'm not going to read through all of this because of time, but it caused a meaning of affections for things of this world, a healing of controversies and animosities, a confession of wrongs. Ellen White and the Great Controversy and so forth. This is emphasized, and Hines, to my knowledge, did not outright oppose that, but he believed nonetheless that the date was mistaken. And he was very firm then against all people on the shut door side of things. So in 1845, the Albany Conference kind of organizes those who believe in the open door and reject the idea that there was a fulfillment in October 22, 1844. And in May, just a month later, a follow-up conference held in New York City declared no confidence in any new messages, visions, dreams, tongues, miracles, extraordinary gifts, revelations, impressions, discerning of spirits, or teachings, not in accordance with God's unadulterated word. Okay, well, we leave out that last phrase for those, from a Seventh-day Adventist standpoint. We believe that there was an extraordinary gift and it was in accordance with God's word, but just about everyone, except for tongues, perhaps, although there was some of that. Just that disqualifies Ellen White just about on every count. So you can see that there is a collision course here between the mainstream so-called Adventist leadership, what remained of it, and the Sabbatarian Adventists for whom the extraordinary gift of visionary Ellen White would be crucial. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to nail this next section down, and I'm going to just pass over it, pretty much, because I'm always fighting the clock. But I know a large percentage of you, and your varying degrees, mostly pretty thoroughly familiar. But my point is that I want to make here, just briefly, without going through everything that I had prepared, is that, yes, it's the easiest distinction. Okay, your first day Adventist and your Seventh-day Adventist. Yes, the doctrinal points there are crucial, but really what's underlying that is a theology of history. The three angels' messages initially, I'm honestly not sure how much, it's not talked about much. I don't know whether I know we don't emphasize it very much, but initially the idea was that the first message was the second Advent message, preached by Miller and Associates, 1840, 1843. Second message, fall of Babylon, coming out of the churches, and then the third message. And when I read James White, and I'm not going to look at this in detail, but this is from his article, Present Truth, and some of the correspondence, you can almost feel the excitement, Yeah, well, he says, never have I had such feelings while holding my text now. We know where we are. We know what's happening because there's a third message, warning against the mark of the beast, and the call to observance of the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus that has to come before the second coming. And the first message went 3 years, and the second one went about a year. And by the time he's writing this, it's maybe 5 years. And he does say that in one article that the third angel message does not hang on time. Right? We don't know exactly how long it's going to be, but the powerful sense of imminence, really a supercharged sense of meaning about what's happening now in the interval between 1844 and the second coming. This, I think, it's probably not controversial to say that Joshua D. Hines had nothing like this. And see these beautiful things that we're passing over them. That sense that there is this period now that is freighted with specific prophetic significance, and gives us this urgent apocalyptic message, didn't quite have. Now, he still believed the second coming was very soon, and that you had to proclaim it to the world. So it's not that he was, just picking up and eating popcorn, but there is a difference there, and I think that is part of and this has often been pointed out, actually, that is what gave the Seventh-day Adventist movement an advantage in this whole question of what makes belief in the second coming resilient after these disappointments. How do you keep believing? All right. Well, now here is, though we're not quite ready to that, and don't worry, I won't detain you too much longer. But the thing that I want to say here is that at this junction, 178 years later, I think that we're now in a position that's more analogous to Himes than the 19th century Adventists were. Now, I'm not talking about any biblical exegesis or theological revision. I'm talking about just the fact that time dissipates that sense of just intense feeling and emotion that we see in James White and the other earliest Adventists about being in this final prophesied period and to participate in the unfolding of prophecy. And so perhaps we're in a position now where some of the things that Himes can offer might be more pertinent. Okay, 1846, Himes, he's eager to get on with mission. He goes to England, his long deferred trip, sets up a publishing office there, starts a periodical, the European Adventist Herald. But he also, along with his preaching tour, he goes around speaking against slavery. Now, there was something called the Evangelical Alliance. They were trying to bring some interdenominational cooperation, not only between the denominations, but also between the British and the American. But some of the American delegates wanted to soften. See, the slavery was already outlawed in England, right? So it was not so much an issue. But the Americans said, we don't want these stringent requirements that would keep slaveholders or those who fellowship with them out of the Evangelical Alliance. But Himes stood alone among the American delegation in opposition. And he called the proposal a miserable compromise of principle, which, if carried out, would be the strongest bulwark of the slave system. William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass were also touring with him. They praised Himes for one man who nobly did his duty. The person on your, is that your right, is George Thompson. He was a famous British abolitionist whom Himes had gotten to know when Thompson made his tour of America in the 1830s. And he also, Himes were close, and Himes talks quite a bit of some very interesting things about Thompson, which we must pass over. But the thing that we must look at is what Himes had to say in one of his reports about the British mission. And I'm indebted to my friend and colleague Kevin Burton for sharing this with me, because he's talking about, this is Himes, and he's talking about his interactions with Garrison and Thompson and others. And about the fifth line down here, he says, in reference to the slave question, as an Adventist, believing that the great systems of iniquity now existing will continue in some form to the end of the world. Yet, with this faith, I am bound to protest against and expose sin in all its manifestations, just as much as though I believe in the world's continuance. Therefore, I dare not meet my judge without having washed my hands thoroughly by bearing a faithful testimony against slavery and by using my influence for its extinction. This is the clearest statement that I know of where Himes tries to explain the connection between his Second Advent faith and his activism. And I think that it is quite significant for us as we consider that Himes still believed in the imminence of Christ's return, but it was a faith that enlivened him more fully to be prepared to meet the judge. And so it generated activism. Ultimately, the paradox may not be resolvable, but here's what Timothy George, I think it partially is, and try to touch on it. But the church historian Timothy George says one of the ironies of church history is that frequently those who have the most acute sense of the future reign of God, of living in the last days, are precisely those who invest themselves with purpose and energy in changing things here and now. All right, well, we're going to move now to toward the end, but I think that you will be interested to know that even though there was this division between Himes and the seventh day Sabbath keeping Adventists, and they were on the shut door side, disreputable, all that. There came a point also when Himes was commissioned by the Advent Christians to start a paper in Buchanan, Michigan, which of course is close to Andrews. It's about 90 miles from Battle Creek. So he had his Voice of the West, and then you've got the Review over in Battle Creek. And initially they're friendly, but then they start getting into some pretty severe controversy. And Joshua Himes starts talking about the delusions of Ellen White's visions and so forth. It gets a little nasty for a while. But then there was another Advent Christian by the name of Miles Grant. And he was just a vicious ecclesiastical fighter. And they referred to him as raids, an unprovoked raid by Miles Grant on both on James White and on Joshua B. Himes. So Himes and the Adventists start to come on more friendly terms, not just for that, but Himes visits while the General Conference is in session, 1873, and speaks for during the Friday evening. And then in 1878, he sends James White the announcement that he's leaving the paper there, and he speaks highly of the work of the Seventh-day Adventists. Also noting on the timeline here, they shared the podium with Garrison for the celebration of the second anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. This thing with Grant, it would be fun to talk about because we get a little scandal and semi-false accusation, but anyway, sorry, we gotta pass it over. And basically he gets kicked out of the Advent Christian. But remember at the beginning, he says, I'm still an Adventist, even though I'm Episcopalian now. His activism continues. He's fighting for women's suffrage out there in South Dakota. This is a suffragist leader of the state saying, we find him today helping in the present struggle to give the ballot to the women of the state. So he speaks well of the health and educational institutions. But then the final part comes here. When he, 1894, he comes to Battle Creek Sanitarium for treatment for throat cancer, I believe it is. It was on the side of his face. Now, interesting, Kellogg says, well, he's a remarkably well-preserved man for 89. But the cancer, of course, was a problem. While he's there, he says, I'm not going to talk about any theological controversies. But I'm just going to enjoy talking with the folks and reminiscing with them about the good old days with Father Miller and so forth. And he attends prayer meeting, and there's a letter from Ellen White, who's down in Australia, asking, for support for the cause. And Hines is a little put out that they're not responding to her. I mean, come on. This is a legitimate thing. She's doing good work. So he sends money along with a letter to Ellen White. And she saw great significance in this. She was really overjoyed. It says that she wrote him back, shows that you have not lost the missionary spirit, which prompted you first to give yourself to the work, and then you give your means to the Lord to proclaim the first and the second angel's message. See, she still has the chronology in mind, and in not directly to Himes, but to his nurse, she says, this is evidence, the latter part of this quote now, that one of the pioneers of the work of giving the message of warning to the world in 1840 to 44 is acting a part now in giving the third angel's message. Now, Himes actually made clear, I don't quite see it the way you do, but you're doing a good work and you should continue. But he became an honorary advocate or champion of the third angel's message. And then we'll bring it to a close. Here, let me just suggest three things by way of summary. What made his faith in the everlasting kingdom at hand resilient? Well, it was grounded in apostolic, historic faith in the reign of Messiah Jesus that would become personal, real, and victorious. At its foundation was not based on a specific date. And it both gained vitality from and demonstrated its authenticity by its embodiment in radical activism. Isn't that a witness when you actually can show people what the kingdom will be like, what it stands for, and refuse to be co-opted by any of the world's ideologies and agendas? He actually did have a little bit of a rebuke and a warning because he thought that the Seventh-day Adventists are getting too prosperous. And it's kind of inconsistent with their talk of imminent second coming. So he left that warning as well. The cancer got aggressive and he died July 27, 1895 in Elk Point. But in his letter to Ellen White just a few months earlier, in which he knew Dr. Kellogg had told him that there was nothing that could be done. He told her, well, clearly my remaining time is going to be painful, and he nonetheless repeated the assurance, I'm looking for the exact quote, but that soon the morn will come and disease, suffering, and so forth will pass away.